When the War of 1812 ended in early 1815, Americans turned their attention west. Millions of acres of fertile land in Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi were available at prices set by the federal government, initially around $2 an acre, with credit terms available. Veterans, farmers, and speculators alike rushed to buy. Federal land sales, which had run at roughly 1 million acres per year before the war, surged in the years that followed. The promise of cheap land and rising commodity prices, especially cotton in the South and grain in the Northwest, drew buyers who expected prices to keep climbing. The fuel for this speculation was paper money issued by state-chartered banks, which multiplied rapidly in the post-war years. Many of these banks held only thin reserves of gold and silver coin, called specie, behind their printed notes. Some frontier banks, later nicknamed wildcat banks, were so poorly capitalized that their notes were nearly worthless as soon as they left the printing press. Yet these notes circulated freely, were extended as loans to land buyers, and were accepted as deposits by other banks. By 1816, the number of state-chartered banks in the United States had grown substantially from the handful that existed before the war, and the total volume of notes in circulation far outpaced the specie available to redeem them. Congress recognized the problem and, after considerable debate, chartered the Second Bank of the United States in April 1816, capitalized at $35 million, making it the largest corporation in the country at the time. The bank was modeled loosely on the First Bank of the United States, which Congress had allowed to lapse in 1811, and was intended to provide a sound national currency and impose discipline on the proliferating state banks. The federal government owned 20% of the stock and deposited its tax revenues in the bank. In theory, the Second Bank could force state banks to maintain adequate specie reserves by demanding redemption of their notes. In practice, the bank's early management had other priorities. William Jones, the bank's first president, allowed the Second Bank's branches to expand credit aggressively rather than restraining the state bank excess. Branches issued their own notes, extended loans on speculative land purchases, and accepted state bank paper without requiring adequate specie backing. The Philadelphia, Baltimore, and especially the western and southern branches were particularly lax. Historians have since characterized Jones's tenure, from 1817 to early 1819, as a period of serious mismanagement in which the bank's own conduct helped enlarge the very bubble it was supposed to prevent. A subsequent congressional investigation found that the Baltimore branch had been the scene of outright fraud, with officers manipulating stock prices and extending unauthorized credit. While the domestic credit machine was running hot, the international environment was quietly shifting. European agriculture, devastated by years of Napoleonic wars, had recovered substantially by 1818, reducing European demand for American cotton and grain. Cotton prices, which had been very high in 1817, dropped sharply over the following 2 years as British textile mills found alternative suppliers and European harvests improved. Because much of the Western land speculation was premised on rising commodity revenues, falling prices meant that the expected income to service land loans was disappearing at exactly the moment those loans came due. The external prop for the boom was being knocked away before anyone had finished building on it. By mid-1818, the Second Bank faced a serious problem of its own. It had far more notes outstanding than it held specie to redeem, leaving it exposed to a run if any significant number of note holders demanded coin. To protect itself, the bank began calling in loans from state banks and directing its branches to contract credit. The bank also reduced the amount of state bank paper it would accept at par. State banks, suddenly under pressure to redeem their own notes in specie they did not hold in sufficient quantities, began in turn calling in loans from their customers. The contraction, once started, moved through the credit system like a wave, each layer demanding repayment from the layer below it. In early 1819, with the bank's situation still precarious, Congress forced out William Jones and installed Langdon Cheves, a former South Carolina congressman who had served as Speaker of the House, as the new president. Cheves had one overriding goal: to save the bank from insolvency. He dramatically accelerated the contraction, reducing the bank's outstanding loans and pressing state banks hard for specie redemption. According to figures cited by historians drawing on the bank's own records, the bank's loan portfolio contracted significantly within his first year. The bank survived. The economic consequences for the broader country were severe. Cheves acquired the nickname, not always offered as a compliment, of the man who saved the bank and crucified the people. The contraction triggered a cascade of failures among state banks that had extended credit well beyond their specie reserves. Banks in Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and the Carolinas were particularly hard hit. When they could not meet demands for specie, they suspended payments, meaning their notes could no longer be redeemed for coin. A note that said it was worth $1 might trade in the open market for 50 cents or less, destroying the savings of anyone who held it. Land values collapsed as forced sales flooded the market with properties buyers could no longer finance. In some areas, Particularly in the West and South, land that had sold at high prices just a year or two earlier was now difficult to sell at any price. The human consequences were severe and widely visible. In eastern cities, unemployment climbed as merchants, craftsmen, and manufacturers lost access to credit and orders dried up. Contemporary accounts from Philadelphia described large numbers of workers without employment and charitable organizations overwhelmed by demand. Debtors' prisons, which still existed in most states at the time, filled with men who could not meet their obligations. In the West, farmers who had borrowed to buy land faced foreclosure, losing both the land and whatever they had paid down on it. Several states passed debtor relief laws allowing delayed repayment, which in turn created conflicts with creditors and led to further court challenges. The suffering was widespread enough that contemporaries referred to what followed as the first great peacetime crisis of the Republic. While the economic crisis unfolded, a related legal fight reached the Supreme Court. Maryland had passed a law taxing notes issued by the Second Bank's Baltimore branch, an effort by the state to raise revenue and, some argued, to constrain the bank's reach within its borders. The bank's cashier, James McCulloch, refused to pay the tax. In March 1819, Chief Justice John Marshall delivered the Supreme Court's unanimous ruling in McCulloch v. Maryland, holding that Congress had the constitutional authority to charter the bank, even though that power is not explicitly listed in the Constitution, and that a state could not tax a federal institution. The ruling settled the bank's legal standing, but did nothing to address the fury building against it among the people who had lost their land and savings. The Panic of 1819 produced a sustained wave of political anger directed at the Second Bank of the United States. Farmers and debtors who had lost their land or their savings blamed the bank's initial recklessness and its subsequent ruthless contraction in nearly equal measure. Politicians in western and southern states channeled that anger into a broader argument that a powerful chartered bank concentrated wealth in the hands of eastern elites at the expense of ordinary Americans. This populist critique did not produce immediate legislative results, but it shaped the political landscape for the following 2 decades. Historians broadly agree that Andrew Jackson, who held personal debts and a lifelong hostility to banks, drew on this legacy when he vetoed the recharter of the Second Bank in 1832 and then systematically dismantled it, leaving the United States without a central bank until the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. The Panic of 1819 established a pattern that has recurred in American and global financial history ever since. Easy credit fuels a boom in a particular asset, prices rise beyond what underlying revenues can sustain, and when credit is withdrawn, prices fall, and the losses fall hardest on those who borrowed most. The Federal Reserve exists partly as a response to the instability produced when no institution was responsible for managing credit conditions across the whole economy. Its dual mandate, to maintain stable prices and support maximum employment, reflects over a century of hard lessons from crises like 1819, 1873, 1907, and 1929. Recognizing that credit cycles are structural features of how modern economies function, not isolated accidents, is one of the most practically useful things financial history has to offer.